So good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to the major presentation this afternoon, Jacques Maritain on Art and Transcendence by Professor Tom Hibbs. I'm Professor Brian Brayman from the Philosophy Department of Boston College. And on a kind of personal note, I've known Tom since 1990. So most of those years he'll admit to have known me, other times perhaps not, but it's a real privilege for me to have an opportunity to introduce him. So as you may or may not be aware, that Tom is currently the J. Newton Razor Senior Professor of Philosophy at Baylor, where he is also Dean Emeritus, having served for 16 years as Dean of the Honors College and as Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Culture. He has published more than 30 scholarly articles and 7 scholarly books. He has a book coming out, I think, in the spring on the aesthetics of Laudato Si. I'm not exactly sure if that's the correct title. So he's incredibly prolific. He's published 2 books on film and philosophy and 1 book, Soliloquies, co-authored by Mako Fujimura. So at press then is this book on theological aesthetics, which I just mentioned, Notre Dame Press. He also has a book on justice and solidarity under contract with Word on Fire Publications. He is published widely in the popular press, with more than 100 reviews and discussion articles on film, theater, art, and higher education in a variety of venues, including First Things, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the New Atlantis, the Wall Street Journal, National Review, and he writes regularly for the Dallas Morning News. 2 of his books on popular culture for me have always been important, and stuff that I do in our philosophy department, Shows About Nothing and The Arts of Darkness, about film noir. So if those are areas of interest, I highly recommend those texts. So on that note, Professor Tom Hibbs.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for coming down from Boston for the conference. It's great to have you here with us. Really happy to be asked to give this paper. I want to thank Darren and his entire staff for all the work they're doing, and David Jeffrey for his work thinking through various elements of this conference and talking with me and actually giving me feedback on parts of the book that are relevant to the paper that I'm going to read today. I do have images which I'll be adverting to toward the end of the talk from George Rouault. This is the last image in the Miserere series, which I'll be talking a little bit about and some others. In his reflections on the end of art, the philosopher Arthur Danto clarifies that the demise of art does not entail that there's no more making of art, nor does it entail the vanishing of a market for art. Instead, for Danto, it has to do with the realization that there are no longer any historically mandated forms of art. Danto rehearses various manifestos of the early to mid 20th century and sees in them attempts to establish what he calls the philosophical truth of art. That is, that art is essentially X and everything that is not X is not or is not essentially art. Danto goes on to suggest that art no longer functions for us in the way it did for our ancestors. It appeals to us not so much as an object of delight, but rather as an object of reflection. We now create art explicitly for the purpose of knowing philosophically what art is. On this point, Danto quotes his chief historical philosophical influence, Hegel, at length from Hegel's Aesthetics. Art, considered in its highest vocation, is and remains for us a thing of the past. Thereby, it has lost for us genuine truth and life and has rather been transformed into our ideas instead of maintaining its earlier necessity in reality and occupying a higher place. What is now aroused in us by works of art is not immediate enjoyment, but our judgment, since we subject to our intellectual consideration the content of art and the work of art's means of presentation. There's a surprising overlap between Danto's Hegelian description of modern art and that of Tom Wolfe's famous send-up in The Painted Word. Attending an exhibition of art from leading figures in 1970, Wolff had this insight about the nature of such art. There at last it was. No more realism. No more representation objects. No more lines, colors, forms, and contours. No more pigments. No more brushstrokes. Art made its final flight, climbed higher and higher in an ever-decreasing, tighter turning spiral until it disappeared up its own fundamental aperture and came out the other side as art theory. Art theory, pure and simple, words on a page, literature undefiled by vision, late 20th century modern art was about to fulfill its destiny, which was to become nothing less than literature, pure and simple. The consequences for art are that its hedonic dimension, the taking pleasure in art, drops out, as does its association with the beautiful. Indeed, suspicion is cast upon art that is beautiful and gives pleasure. Danto notes the exception that proves the rule, impressionist art, enjoyed by the masses and despised by critics. While Wolff mocks the turn to theory, Danto embraces it as the natural terminus of the history of art. Such a welcoming posture to the decline of the influence of art is integral to Chicago University philosopher Robert Pippin's interpretation of the human condition. Pippin thinks that the decline of representational art is a natural result of the turn to the subject in the modern period. Traditional representational art leaves little room for the affirmation of subjectivity. That blind spot, Pippin says, is the essential limitation of traditional art. Representational art, he goes on to say, cannot adequately express the full subjectivity of experience, the wholly self-legislating, self-authorizing status of the norms that constitute such subjectivity. And thus, representational art cannot express who we now are. For Pippin's Hegelian interpretation of our current social condition, the diminution of the subject matter of art corresponds to a decline in the felt need for such art among citizens. Art could no longer play the social role it once did after the shift in modernist understanding of artistic experience away from the sensual and the beautiful and toward the conceptual. The turn to art that is about the subject and increasingly about the nature and status of art itself is a natural result of modern social conditions. Human beings, Pippin says, require less and less sensible representational imagery in order to understand themselves. The rationalism of modern life in the natural order through science and in the political order through democratic liberalism leads to the disenchantment of both orders. Pippin quotes Hegel. I'll be through with Hegel in another page or so. So if you're getting dizzy, the vertigo will vanish soon. Spirit only occupies itself with objects so long as there is something secret in them. But now everything is revealed and nothing is obscure. The vanishing of mystery accompanies the rise of bourgeois society and the abandoning of the claims to transcendence. The modern social world, Pippin comments, may be rational, but it is just thereby not very beautiful, and its meaning is not very mysterious. Being modern for Pippin demands being radically critical, relying only on our own reason and spontaneous self-legislation. The wholly self-legislating, self-authorizing status of modern norms for Pippin is not a self-evident claim. And furthermore, the cutting off of human subjects from external and transcendent sources of truth, goodness, and beauty not only disenchants the world, as Pippin notes, it also pushes us in the direction of nihilism. As Pippin himself puts it, nihilism is a failure of desire, the flickering out of some erotic flame. Pippin is not a Nietzschean, although he engages with Nietzsche on nihilism. He concludes that Nietzsche's remedy, the will to power or eternal recurrence, fails to rescue us from nihilism. The right diagnosis, Pippin says, would have been to involve a re-engagement with the Socratic question that Nietzsche so powerfully introduced. What are the conditions of the possibility of a life now? What makes leading a life possible? But as those of you who have read Kant may have detected, Pippin doesn't really want to return us to Socrates. He wants to channel Socrates through Kant, as is evident by his description of Socrates as pursuing conditions of possibility, something I don't think we find a lot of in the Platonic corpus. Now, I mentioned earlier that Pippin's claim about the self-legislating, self-justifying subject in modernity is questionable. A number of philosophers do question it. Contrary to Pippin, someone like Stanley Rosen holds that averting nihilism involves the recovery of ordinary experience. For Rosen, the Socratic understanding of eros underscores the primacy of receptivity, not of our constructing of the real, but of our receptivity to it. Erotic desire, he writes, is not the will. That is not a projection from the intellect outward or the constitution of a world, but a force from above and outside the soul that comes down into it and raises it to the heavens. Pippin himself does not avoid the problem. Here's how he puts it. He says, what he's been describing in Hegel represents a kind of wager that the satisfaction of modern or bourgeois, romantic, familial, economic, and political life is enough, that we could do without beautiful depictions of humanity and our lives, or even sublime warnings about its potential emptiness. And so we could do without the living role for fine art. Pippin himself says, I think that it is fairly clear by now that, to say the least, this was a bad bet. As the whole phenomena of aesthetic politics, especially in fascism, demonstrates. But that is surely another and longer story. Indeed it is. On the issue of subjectivity and altered self-understanding of art, there are similarities between Pippin and Jacques Maritain. Yet Maritain is never as sanguine as Pippin about the results. Adrift from tradition and from the embodied condition of human existence, modern art risks becoming deeply unstable. First, it risks failing to meet the natural hunger of the human soul for beauty. Second, it's vulnerable to the law of diminishing returns as it follows out the logic of disembodiment. In fact, these are precisely the concerns about certain possible playing out of modern art that Maritain examines in his great work, Creative Intuition, which began as the Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery of Art in 1952. Among all modern Thomists, Maritain devoted the most attention to questions of art, and he did so not just as a theorist. He was in some measure a practitioner, and he also was in regular conversation with a host of 20th century artists, most famously Georges Rouault, but also Chagall, Stravinsky, Cocteau, and many others. And the influence is mutual. He impacted artists as much as they impacted his own writing. His great student, and in a way a better philosopher even than Maritain, Yves Simon, commented that an artist, a 20th century artist, should be interested in scholasticism and should use the principles of this philosophy to understand and explain what is going on in the vanguard of painting, music, and poetry in the 20th century, will remain one of the best surprises that ever confronted a historian of philosophy. As the Dominican Aidan Nichols has shown, his early work, Art and Scholasticism, had an immediate impact in England on the craftsman Eric Gill and the painter David Jones. Thomas Merton, Flannery O'Connor read Maritain with profit, as have in our own time Dana Gioia and Makoto Fujimura. And Seamus Haney, perhaps most impressively, deploys Maritain's account of creative intuition at length in an essay he wrote about his own creative process, an essay called Sixth Sense, Seventh Heaven, in the Dublin Review in 2002. Like Pippin, Maritain recognizes and approves of the fact that modern art involves an enlargement of the role of subjectivity. But Maritain is always careful to speak of the discovery of the subjective conditions of art, especially in the 19th century, as a double awakening. An awakening of the self to itself and to nature. So it's not merely an awakening of the subject alone. The subjective awakening of the artist to her own freedom and to the internal sources of the work of art, Maritain says, is inseparable from, is one with another requirement, the grasping of the objective reality of the inner and the outer world. Maritain sees in the greater awareness of the subjective conditions of art an advance. He says it marks an invaluable advance and a great adventure. Yet he is concerned about the temptation of artists who, having realized their subjective freedom, would seek a completely disembodied art, seeking a liberation first from sense and language and then from even abstract form. Such art, Maritain writes, becomes walled in. Art thus renounces seeing into the inner depths of the world of nature, of visible and corporeal being. It cuts itself off from its connection with sense perception. Maritain draws parallels in a number of places between this strain of modern art and philosophical idealism, which cuts off the connection of the intellect to the real. But modern art need not and does not always follow this path. Where the idealist trap is avoided, art continues to see into the mystery of things. As the contemporary political philosopher David Walsh observes, a certain strain of modern art serves to liberate us from the epistemological straitjacket in which idealism would trap us. Now, Maritain's own views have been criticized for having a solipsistic and messianic view of art and artists. C.A. Sakariru puts it, Maritain paid too little attention to the expressive integrity of the art object and allowed his aesthetics to be overdetermined by its creative aspects. He fails to allow the work of art, she says, to take full possession of itself. The claim here, the objection here to Maritain, is that the meaning and intelligibility of the work of art are functions of subjective and intersubjective agencies and powers. It seems to me from the passage I just read above that the awakening to the self is actually a double awakening. An awakening to the subjective conditions of art and an awakening to the artist's subjectivity to the external world undermines her claim. However, or at least it's much more complicated than what she allows. However, it is right to say that Maritain's accentuation of the subjective conditions often leads him to focus, and maybe this is just his work as a philosopher, to focus too much on what artists say and too little on the form and content of specific works of art. Maritain approaches the question of art and transcendence in a number of ways. One way is in terms of what he calls the infinite mirror of analogy of beauty. Precisely because artistic contemplation is not a full abstraction in the philosophical sense, for Maritain, it remains to some extent at the level of sense and imagination and does not terminate in an abstract concept. Art is open to indefinite expression. Indeed, our encounter with art gives rise to a potential indefinite set of analogies. It says and gives more than what it is. And artwork makes present, Maritain says, together with itself, something else, and still something else, and still something else indefinitely in the infinite mirror of analogy. The associations latent within the work of art and latent within the world in which it is embedded branch out indefinitely. The imaginative fertility of any particular work of art helps to explain how encounters with works of art can inspire other but quite novel and quite different works of art. It helps to account for the unpredictable character of artistic creativity, even in settings that could be quite traditional. What Maritain calls the infinite mirror of analogy is a source of surprise and wonder for both viewers and artists. Now, this notion of transcendence in the infinite mirror of analogy could be understood in merely serial and horizontal terms. That is, as calling to mind this and that and something else. If that were so, this is a kind of transcendence that almost anyone, perhaps even a Hegelian, could acknowledge. Yet Maritain also holds that the fecundity of art points in the direction of God as the absolute towards which all experience of beauty tends. Now, in his famous book on the ontology of the work of art in Maritain, J.W. Henke points out the precise nature of the argument is a bit hard to make out. There's no explicit reference to God inherent in the experience of beauty, although Maritain does develop in that early work, Art and Scholasticism, briefly, a Platonic account of beauty in terms of image and exemplar. Perhaps some sort of argument could be derived from the erotic character of encounter with the beautiful. Any encounter with a beautiful object gives rest, but that rest is only momentary. In fact, the encounter with the beautiful can and often does arouse in us a desire for a greater experience of beauty, perhaps for an experience of beauty that satiates entirely. Just as the achievement of knowledge gives rest, knowing this or that truth, but only momentarily, even as it incites us to a greater and more comprehensive knowledge, so too the experience of the beautiful can call forth a longing for greater beauty. Henke writes, "Beautiful things give joy, but in their flaws and limitations as they confront our longing for an unalloyed delight, they turn us in the direction of that which can give complete joy, a perfect and unlimited beauty." When Maritain turns from the artist to the viewer, he asserts that in the encounter with the beautiful, we are receptive of a gift, a manifestation. And this is perhaps another sense of transcendence connected to art for Maritain. The experience of the beautiful, he writes, has the savor of the terrestrial paradise because it restores for a moment the peace and simultaneous delight of the intellect and the senses. Maritain notes that the contemplative, the artist, the one bound to wisdom, the other to beauty, are naturally close, and argues that there is a curious analogy between the fine arts and wisdom. They are ordered to an object which transcends us and which is of value in itself and whose amplitude is limitless, for beauty, like being, is infinite. There are experiences of transcendence for Maritain involved in the very encounter with the beautiful. We transcend the world of utility and instrumentality, since the encounter with beauty is inherently satisfying, just as the contemplation of knowledge is inherently satisfying. It is to be desired not for anything other than the experience itself. In the moment of resting in the beautiful object, we enjoy a kind of timelessness, perhaps an intimation of immortality. We also transcend anxious concern with ourselves. While we might reflectively note the affinity between our intellect and the objects of beauty, we are not in the moment of contemplating the beautiful focused on ourselves, but rather on the object. We are drawn out of ourselves. As David Walsh again puts it, beauty is the means by which we respond to the pull of existence. This is its deepest meaning. Walsh and Maritain here revive something of the ancient and erotic conception of the beautiful, one that sees in the encounter with any object of beauty the seeds of transcendence. Maritain himself repudiates any cramped notions of art as imitations. He's actually quite critical of Renaissance art as the chief model of artistic beauty. Still, in the creation and presentation of a beautiful work of art, the artist taps into the mystery of things. The beautiful has, for him as for Aquinas, the splendor of intelligibility. Splendor indicates the secret of the form, the ontological secret that these objects bear within them, their spiritual being, he says, their operating mystery. For Maritain, beauty thus draws us into the experience of being as a gift. There are parallels here between Maritain's aesthetics and his metaphysics. In the latter, he defends the intelligibility of being and a distinction between essence and existence. This is complicated, of course, but I'll only touch upon it here. Essence is dependent in some sense on being. Each concretely existing thing presupposes an act of existence. Being is thus a gift, not something owed to any essence. He writes, if being is superabundant and communicative of itself, if it gives itself, the response of love is thereby justified. Metaphysics for him is devoted to the mystery of the act of existing. Now, there are important debates over whether Maritain's notion of an intuition of being can undergird the Thomistic notion of the science of metaphysics, but thankfully we need not trouble ourselves with those debates here. Maritain's accent on the intellect's primordial receptivity to being and his sense that the sheer appearance and presence of being is a kind of gift can be apprehended apart from claims about metaphysics. Moreover, this sort of unscientific phenomenological account can arise from ordinary experience, and perhaps most strikingly, it can arise in our encounter with the beautiful. We need not pursue metaphysics before aesthetics, and in fact, the experience of the beautiful can generate insights relevant to metaphysics and perhaps prod us to investigate the sort of questions proper to that discipline. Going even further in his analysis of art and transcendence, Maritain argues that because beauty is a transcendental, it tends of itself to draw the soul beyond the created. Here, Maritain envisions transcendence not just in a horizontal and expansive way, but also in a vertical and intensive manner. Maritain's insights here find surprising confirmation in the poetry of Robinson Jeffers, a mid-20th century California poet, sometimes called the poet laureate of the environmental movement. Now, Jeffers is a pantheist and a self-described anti-humanist. But he sees, and in this he shares something with Maritain, he sees his poetic calling as correcting the modern idealist turn to the subject by returning us, and here's the anti or inhumanism, returning us to the insignificance of the human within the vastness of nature. In words that nearly echo Maritain, he argues that a strain of modern art resembles idealism, based in the illusion that the human mind is the source of meaning. In a poem called Credo, where he expresses his chief tenets as a poet and a pantheist, he rejects the view that nothing is real except as we make it, and that in the powers of mind, we can create an ocean more real than the ocean, the salt, the actual appalling presence, the power of the waters. Jeffers urges us to adopt a humbler view, a harder mysticism. The heartbreaking beauty, he writes, will remain even when there is no heart to break for it. He turns from this to a direct attack on the symbolist movement, renouncing intelligibility in order to concentrate on the music of poetry. The symbolists had turned off the road into a narrowing lane. Their successors could only make further renunciation. Ideas had gone, now meter had gone. Imagery would have to go. This sounds like Tom Wolfe. Then recognizable emotions would have to go. Perhaps at least even words might have to go. Every advance required the elimination of some aspect of reality, and what would it profit me to know the direction of this modern poetry if I did not like the direction, Jeffers says. For him, art is a corrective to idealism. It accentuates the beautiful as the pull of the real. The problem for Jeffers is that we have relied on a human-centered conception of nature, assuming or wishing that nature accorded more closely with our desires. He writes in Carmel Point, where he lived for much of his life, we must uncenter our minds from ourselves. We must unhumanize our views a little and become confident as the rock and the ocean that we were made from. The goal of poetry for him is to feel greatly, understand greatly, and express greatly the natural beauty. There is perhaps no more ambitious defense in poetry of the centrality of beauty to its calling than in the 20th century than in the work of Robinson Jeffers. Jeffers' work, different from Maritain obviously because he's a pantheist and an anti-humanist, is also, like Maritain's, opposed to the position of Danto, Hegel, and Pippin. And interestingly, he's such an honest poet that he acknowledges that in the human encounter with the beautiful, we are brought into a contemplation of that which exceeds and makes possible all human knowing. But we are also brought into a contemplation where we discover an astonishing affinity between the beauty of things and the hunger of the human heart. What are we to make of this affinity? What's an inhumanist to make of this affinity? Of the concord between mind and cosmos. Here's what Jeffers says. He acknowledges the feeling that this human and in itself subjective sense of beauty is occasioned by some corresponding quality or temper or arrangement in the object. Why else, he writes, should a neutral thing, a wave or the sea or a hill, be somehow lovely and loveworthy and become more so the more it is realized by contemplation? The feeling of deep earnestness and nobility in natural objects and in the universe, these are human qualities, not mineral or vegetable. But it seems to me I would not impute them into the objects unless there is something in not man that corresponds to these qualities in man. And he ends himself with a kind of wager. This may be delusion, or it may be called mystical certainty. There is no external proof either way. But here, before he turns back to theoretical judgment of his expression of his experience, he affirms the experience of natural beauty as a kind of gift. The condition not just of the negation of the human, but of its self-affirmation and of an invitation of the human into transcendence with the cosmos. Now, transcendence itself can be a deeply ambiguous notion. I don't know how many senses Maritain has. I don't know how many senses, unless I go back and count them, I've had in this paper. That's one reason that I began with the Hegel-Pippin view, which in its focus on subjectivity to the denigration of representation, denies just about every possible kind of transcendence. It might allow for that linear associative transcendence of the infinite mirror of analogy. It also allows for a kind of transcendence from the object to the mind, but it is, at that point, as Maritain says of certain strains of modern art, walled in. And that's not a very interesting notion of transcendence. Now, Maritain, as I've already noted, talks about the association of beauty and transcendence in a number of ways. There's the transcendence just mentioned, the mirror of analogy, which arises in the very way works of art prompt all sorts of associations. There's also the transcendence involved in the experience of the mysteries of human life and the natural world, the ones that Jeffers focuses on. These can draw us into a contemplation of the meanings latent in persons and things. There's a further sense of transcendence involved in the experience of the beautiful as a gift, reflecting the gift of being itself. And even when Maritain focuses on the subjective conditions of art, he also, as I've noted a number of times already, still insists that art communicates something of the mystery of things. As is often the case for Maritain, George Rouault is the exemplar. He says of Rouault, the pictures of Rouault, as of the other great modern painters, each one is an ideogram of himself, of the artist. But each one is also, and by the same token, an ideogram of the mystery of things, of some interior aspect and meaning caught in the reality of the visible world. whose forms and appearances, before being recast in a new fabric on his canvas, are scrutinized by his eye, implacably attentive to the most fleeting signs and nuances. The contemplative delight over the suitability between beauty and the human mind, evident in both Maritain and Jeffers, can engender wonder at such fittingness, and perhaps an inquiry into the source or ultimate cause of that aptness. Such meditations and inquiries bring us to the cusp of the religious. But this raises, and here I turn to my concluding section, a question about what we might call and how we might understand religious transcendence. For religious transcendence is sometimes accused of advocating a kind of escape from humanity, a flight from the natural, the bodily, and the created. A related concern here has to do with what we might call facile transcendence, the tracing of a path to otherworldliness or redemption that avoids or ignores deprivation, loss, suffering, and despair. I would summarize these problems with and concerns about transcendence in terms of a positive task for religious art. What it needs, among the things it needs to supply, is an art that is authentically eschatological. I'd like to suggest that we find a particular formulation of aesthetic eschatology in Rouault, particularly in his late landscapes, which one commentator, Su-Yun Kang, who we had to Baylor, sees as his preferred medium late in his career. Rouault is relevant for a number of reasons. The association with Maritain that I've already mentioned. He was also never tempted by facile transcendence, as you can see from this image that concludes the Miserere, an image in art full of horror at the crucifixion of Christ. It's an image of Veronica's veil, which is peppered throughout his greatest work, the Miserere. And even in his non-religious subjects, say his early paintings of prostitutes, judges, and clowns, he focuses on the destitution and the temptation to despair of modern commercial society. He's been accused, especially in this early period, of the opposite of facile transcendence, of wallowing in degradation. His misshapen, despairing, almost lifeless prostitutes, his maniacally sneering, arrogant judges, and his rueful clowns highlight, I would argue, the disorders of the human condition, the misery of human greatness. Like Pascal, one of his great influences, Rouault sees misery or wretchedness as balanced with a sense of greatness, or rather, to be more precise, it is in the very judgment that something is wretched that we implicitly apprehend greatness. At a minimum, a greatness or a standard in light of which we call this or that miserable, disordered, wretched, etc. As Rouault puts it in a direct quotation to Pascal, he calls his sorrowful clowns dispossessed kings. In his late landscapes, though, we enter a world transformed. Here, Rouault's use of color, these are the two images I want to look at, intensifies as gloomy scenes give way to images of vibrant light, and even vibrant light in the midst of gloomy scenes. In this shift, Rouault's not suggesting a kind of romantic return to childhood innocence, but he's also not opting for a radically anthropocentric paradigm in which nature is a raw material at the disposal of the human will. In the context of the Miserere, with its focus on the degradation bought by the human penchant for vain delusions, his landscapes there, which I'm not showing images of, clearly indicate the pollution of the human landscape by disordered human desire. I want to take up one image from a late work from 1947, the Stella Vespertina, that includes a number of landscapes. The opening image, this one, De Profundis, contains a large tombstone in front of which stand two mourners joined in an embrace of grief. While the mourners are clothed appropriately in black and purple, their embrace suggests not just separation and death, but the consolation of human sympathy. Despite the occasion of loss and anguish, the color scheme is vibrant. In the center, just above the tomb, is a large orangish red cross, and behind it is a bright sun with a multicolored sky and gentle hues of blue, green, and yellow. There is a kind of serenity here in the midst of grief. But Rouault is not counseling facile transcendence. This image indicates that transcendence is not to be earned by averting or avoiding tragedy and suffering, but by traveling directly through them. One of the more notable landscapes from 1948, Autumn Nazareth, which is in the Vatican Museum. Here, shades of blue, green, and brown in the sky, grass, and trees gently meld into one another and create an ambiance of warm harmony. Near the top of the painting, in yellow and orange, which a thick black circumference is the sun. In the midst of this natural setting, there's a road leading to some buildings. In the foreground, in an opening among the trees, there are 6 persons grouped in 3 sets of pairs. The human figures here are shadowy, as one commentator puts it, hardly distinguishable from their natural surroundings. One of the individuals at roughly the center, not exactly, but roughly the center, is shrouded in a halo. But the halo itself is subtle. The way the human presence is diminished in space and size, and in some ways conformed to the surrounding natural shapes, makes it seem to fit some version of romanticism or some version of placing the human as a small subset within the whole. And yet it doesn't share any inhumanistic assumptions of an opposition between the human and the natural. What's more, a kind of sacred serenity pervades the entire cosmos, a vision of a world remade and transformed by beauty. Some of these landscapes call to mind, and I talk about this at much greater length in the book, the distinction that Pope Francis draws between disenchanted nature and creation. He writes, nature is usually seen as a system which can be studied, understood, and controlled. Creation, by contrast, can only be understood as a gift from the outstretched hand of the Father of all, and as a reality illuminated by love, which calls us together into universal communion. I think we get a humble glimpse of that in this and in others' late landscapes. Rouault's art at this late period helps to restore our sense of our place within the whole. But the notion of a return to home or to our place within the whole, to an original home, is as problematic as certain forms of transcendence that counsel flight from nature. Home is not a simple notion, as Matthew Crossman and Miloslav Volf in their book just published by Baylor University Press on Luke put it, the hunger for home is return and advent intertwined. It's memory and imagination, restoration and transformation, creation and consummation. I think that's what Rouault is trying to communicate in this beautiful late landscape. He is trying to get right the conception of transcendence as homecoming. And he gets it right, I think, in ways that philosophers and theologians so often do not. In Autumn Nazareth, we see a new heaven and a new earth, not as an escape from, but as a transformation of this very world. In that vision, nature itself testifies to the beautiful generosity of God, especially in this and other places on behalf of the poor and the weak. I'd like to end with a quotation from Pope Francis from the very end of Laudato Si, because it seems to me that this image fits very nicely with this passage. At the end, he writes, we will find ourselves face to face with the infinite beauty of God. and be able to read with admiration and happiness the mystery of the universe, which with us will share in unending plenitude. Even now we are journeying toward the Sabbath of eternity, the New Jerusalem, toward our common home in heaven. Jesus says, I make all things new. Eternal life will be a shared experience of awe, in which each creature resplendently transfigured will take its rightful place and have something to give those poor men and women who will have been liberated once and for all. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for that talk. The reading arts classes have completely changed my life and my work. It's kind of like a finger back to a path of art.
So I'm going to put you in right after the Seamus Haney reference from now on, Andrew.
But my question
Andrew's a painter.
with Haney and Makoto, Flannery O'Connor, Jones, looking at their work as artifacts, yourself. Oh. So my question is, looking at artists that were affected by this traditional or Thomistic understanding of art as a virtue, is there something that you yourself as a critic have noticed about the character of their work? Is there something that after a Flannery O'Connor, a David Jones, a Fujimara reads that work you can see, or is it more in the working method? Like, how do you see it manifest itself in the artifacts?
You know, I think the funny thing is that from what I've read, and I'm not an expert in 20th century classical music, but I think the clearest sign of a turn after conversations with Maritain is Stravinsky's classical period. It's evident that he was in conversation and reading Maritain. That most of the other artists were already pretty established with their style, and I think what they found, and this is clearly what Haney finds, is, oh my goodness, here's a language for the stages of artistic expression from the last third of creative intuition, which is what Haney is quoting, that helps me to articulate what I do, right? So I think that's true for Dana Gioia from conversations I've had with him. I think it's true for Makoto, who will be speaking tomorrow. You know, Flannery was just tired of getting all these letters from people telling her to do something uplifting, right? And so when she read Maritain, and Maritain, it said, it's not about the moral intention of the artist, it's about the good of the work of art. Just this burden was lifted from her, right? That she was actually doing the right thing as what she would come to call herself a hillbilly Thomist, right? So I think and you know, Merton's studying Blake when he reads this, and he finds in Blake's images and in his poetry kind of seeds of transcendence, and Maritain gives him a language for how art can function in that way. So I think for most of them, with the possible exception of Stravinsky, Cocteau maybe, because that conversation was intense, both about how to live and how to be an artist. For most of them, it came as a language to them that helped them to articulate the practice that they had already been engaged in.
Right. I'll say as a closing for me, I think to your point, it's like he allowed us to suffer beautifully in our work. I think that's what that language allowed us to do. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. This is great. I mean, it's so rich, and one of the things that has me wondering about is what kind of space there is for politics in this Maritainian vision of art. I mean, clearly Maritain himself has deep political investments that he's pursuing at the same time as he's in conversation with these artists.
Yeah.
And go to the Rothko Chapel and you can see like libraries of Maritain, and they're giving out a human rights award, and also Rothko's are everywhere. So there is a kind of togetherness of art and politics, but it's kind of oblique. you know,
Yes.
and it's different now. Like there's this artist right now. I was just talking with a woman who is an artist and works at a university where she teaches artists, and it's a very political moment in art where the artists are very explicitly political, and to make their way into the sort of cultural milieu to stake their claim,
Yeah.
they have a kind of political project that's really like driving a lot of their artwork. And I guess I wonder, is that kind of relationship to politics, does it work with this kind of transcendence?
Yeah.
Or, because politics itself is usually thought of as such an eminent set of goals. So what
Yeah.
place is there for politics in this?
So, a couple things about this. Maritain's really worried about any type of subordination of art to ideology, right? So, he's got worries of this emphasis upon the subjective freedom of the artist, right? And that the artist's main task is to be true to the vision that he or she has of the beautiful or whatever it might be. He's really worried about anything coming in from the outside and tarnishing that. What should we think about that claim? I think on the one hand, he's right to be worried about the instrumentalization from start to finish of art to something else, to some other good, whether that's political or even religious. And here, the objection that I mentioned to Maritain's sort of prophetic, excessively subjective conception of the art, I think surfaces a little bit. Because Maritain doesn't want to deny that Dante's making great art. In fact, he thinks Dante, in part because the cultural conditions, could make greater art than anyone in the 19th or 20th century could. Baudelaire in the 19th century, with his negative way, does about as well as you can in the absence of the kind of ambient support of a civilization. I think it's important to either correct Maritain here or narrow this question of the freedom of artistic expression, because it seems really clear that, and this is connected also with a division between, in some places, between a kind of hard division between the fine and the useful arts, right? Which also runs through Maritain and through much of 20th century aesthetic theory. So Maritain's aware in Dante and others that the way in which the artist is formed by education, by religion, by community, by friendships, legitimately can enter into the artist being faithful to his or her own artistic vision. It's as if he wants to say, at the moment of creation, of making, the artist can't be thinking about fulfilling an external need. But I would say that he can be interpreted as saying, up to that moment, all sorts of things can come in, right? And some of those could have been, in a way, not virtuous influences, but once they're channeled into the art, they can have salutary results. So that's the first thing. Maritain's really wary of the kind of 20th century ideological attempt to enlist artists to prop up political movements. The other thing is this hard distinction, which surfaces in some places particularly later. It's not so much there in art and scholasticism. And it's something that someone like Eric Gill is questioning in Maritain, right? Because the crafts he thinks are really important to be considered as very close to fine arts. And Maritain sometimes wants a really hard distinction between the fine and the useful arts. But of course, that creates a world where we're instrumentalizing everything except when we go to museums and look at fine arts, right? It's just a bizarre way to think about civilization and to think about art as playing a role in the world. So I actually argue in the book that Maritain's views need to be, some places he tempers that, and I've quoted those, but that really needs to be tempered and rethought, it seems to me. But that's connected to this subjective freedom of the artist that he so much wants to celebrate. But then he's got people like Dante and many others, including Rouault, who are heavily influenced, as every artist is, by all sorts of things that are going on. So it's not, the worry is that you would end up with a subjectivity. The worry is you would end up with what he dislikes about certain strains of modern art, which is subjectivity for its own sake. So I don't know what he would say exactly about the contemporary artists that you're talking about, though. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk and the provocations. I just missed a few things that you said, and one thing I think you were quoting Maritain, and you said fecundity of art points toward a God or something. Do you remember this? It followed after infinite mirror of analogy.
Yes. Well, I mean, there are places, many places, where he says that the experience of the richness of art points to God.
Okay. Okay.
And as I mentioned, in some cases, this is as in certain passages in art and scholasticism, it's a straightforward kind of Platonic image exemplar, where any image of beauty calls forth an exemplar of beauty. In other places, I think it has to do with this natural desire for the beautiful that turns out to be a kind of correlate of the natural desire for an infinite being. Those are two, not unrelated, but different ways in which he talks about that.
Okay. And savor of the terrestrial paradise is also a phrase of Maritain's?
It is. Yes, it is. Yeah.
Next.
Thanks so much for that. I wanted to just ask a quick question about what you said in answer to the previous question regarding what Maritain gives that Blake doesn't, having to do with what you're calling eschatological aesthetics.
Yeah.
What is it that Maritain gives that Blake doesn't?
Well, I don't know enough about Blake to know that. I mean, my reference to Blake was Merton's study of Blake at Columbia when he found Art and Scholasticism in Manhattan at a bookstore. And I think he was moved by Blake to see poetry and painting as something that drew him out of himself in a way that could transform his character and help him to see more clearly the real and ultimately to see God more clearly. And I think, again, he's not, if I recall correctly, the passages from Seven Storey Mountain, which I haven't read recently, he's not seeing Maritain he's not so much comparing Maritain with Blake as he is saying that Blake provoked these thoughts and longings in him that Maritain now gives him a kind of theoretical language and an Orthodox Catholic language for articulating those. And so it was an important step in his movement, not just toward monasticism, but toward the church.
Thank you, Tom. Really, really engaging and interesting talk. I'm trying to discern Maritain's, it seems like you're suggesting there was an essential connection between the beautiful and transcendence in his thought. That's in the first part of the talk.
Yeah.
And I very much appreciated the qualifier that there's not a facile transcendence later on, but I'm looking at the Miserere paintings and I'm not seeing what we would call classically beautiful form or motifs and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And what I thought you were saying is, well, the beautiful is somehow present in, it makes you feel so bad you really want the beautiful, right? And that just kind of makes art into something like an empty signifier. And I've always felt this way. What about the good and the true in that painting? You know, we can still stick with the trivium if we need to. Does the beautiful have to be there for transcendence in some way to achieve transcendence in Maritain's thought? Because it seems to me he's sort of shoehorning a concept in there that I'm not sure he really needs to. But maybe I'm just misinterpreting that.
What's he shoehorning?
That trying to make that beautiful in order to make it transcendent.
Okay.
There are other thinkers who would say, well, there's such a thing as negative transcendence.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, maybe if you could just be more specific about how he would address that.
You think of, I've got a footnote in here to Paul Schrader's book on Bresson and others on art and transcendence, which is mainly about transcendence through negation, right? Or opening up. So it's about silence, it's about emptiness, it's about negation as the spaces in film or moments in film where transcendence opens up, right? I think Terrence Malick saying Tree of Life does this by shifting from the horizontal depiction to those live oaks where he's looking up from the camera's from the ground looking up, right? So he's got two different dimensions that are constantly coming in, suggesting that the linear dimension, and that's kind of messed up anyhow, right? It's not just going in one direction temporally, but that we need this other dimension of transcendence, of the vertical, to enter in. So I think those are all really important. I don't know that Maritain talks so much about those. So if we want to talk about the miserere and beauty, first of all, I think we need to go back and be really worried about Kant and the hard distinction between the beautiful and the sublime, right? And the beautiful for him, it just had such an awful impact upon art. I see that really clearly teaching this philosophy of art class this semester, where we started with Kant, Hegel, and Nietzsche. Because the beautiful there is just the pleasant, right? And what artist wants to do that, right? What artist just wants to present? It's the kind of thing we can get in a display at Target or Hobby Lobby, right? What artist really wants to just present that, right? So art becomes more and more connected with the sublime, and the supposition is that the sublime, inherited from Kant, has to be opposed to the beautiful. One of the reasons I love Jeffers, the pantheist poet, is that he has one of the strongest senses of the sublime, of the cosmos as an overwhelming context and presence for everything human. But he calls the task of the poet to feel, to see, and to express greatly the natural beauty, so that the sublime is somehow not separated from the beautiful, it's within it, right? So that, I think, probably what we need, and I can't do this right now, is an enlarged conception of the beautiful. First of all, rejecting the Kantian identification of the beautiful with the pretty or the pleasant, right? So here's in the Miserere, the Miserere is it mixes secular and sacred in the way Rouault's work often does. Veronica's veil is the key thing here. I think that Rouault is actually playing off of the crisis of the visible, the breakdown of the sense that images actually point to anything real. If you think about this image of the veil, and then there are some others, there's a De Profundis image where you've got the veil hanging on a wall inside a room. There you've got, follow the cascade of images. You've got an image, that veil on the wall, which is itself within an image, the larger plate, which is itself an image of the actual veil, which is itself an image of Christ, who is himself, as Colossians tells us, the image of the invisible God, right? It's really brilliant what he's doing. And of course, what those images, which start out in the Miserere as an image of Christ and an image of a lonely human being, frequently the posture of Christ and the human being are the same. If I had the rest of it here, we could go through that. And then they come together in the scene where there's someone saying, Lord, it is you, I recognize you. So you have the vagabond of misfortune that he talks about at the beginning coming together with Christ. Christ takes on our image in the incarnation. And Christ takes on the image of the most sorrowful, the most miserable, the most downcast, the most marginalized of human beings. And in that ugliness, it is ugly, Christ somehow matches it, and Christ is there. Much of that ugliness has to do with our fear of death, I think, in Rouault. But when we finally reach death in that room with all the skulls, just before the image of I recognize you, we find someone who's there waiting for us, who has already been abandoned unto the nothingness of death and has taken that ugliness into himself, and who knows us better than we know ourselves and offers us the miserere, the mercy of Veronica's veil. So this image, which is an image, I started out saying, I think it is an image of horror. It's also, by the time, if you've meditated with Rouault in the course of the Miserere, it's also a very beautiful image. But you have to be taught and transformed in how you see, feel, and describe things. And I think the Miserere offers that pedagogy in seeing, feeling, and saying. So that's a longer way of saying what we need is to think about the beautiful in a much richer and much more complicated way.
Tom, thank you for a very thought-provoking talk, and this answer to this question, very inspiring in itself, so I almost hesitate to ask another question. It's probably challenging when someone asks you something who knows a whole lot about what they're talking about, but it's even more dangerous when someone asks who is totally ignorant. So feel free to pat me on the head. And
I've heard this Jim Benninghoff start out before. I've been in too many faculty interviews where you start out this way, Jim.
Well, no. But anyway, a line you've never probably heard in Jerry Maguire is, "You had me at the infinite mirror of analogy." But I'm wondering whether...
I thought it was "Show me the money." That was the line.
That's that one I have heard in Jerry Maguire. But can you address at all a connection between this infinite mirror of analogy and a semiotic concept of iconic representation? Is that something that makes any sense, and does that have any implication, or is the semiotic idea operating on a different plane in some way? And
of icon.
yeah, icon particularly, yeah. With some sense of resemblance between, in this case, the artwork or some element of the artwork, the blues and the landscape, whatever, and our lived experience. And then if there are implications of that for the eventual leading to God. I mean, I've often thought of the semiotic idea as this infinite kind of, you can go on and on and on depending on the experience of the listener or the observer. So anyway,
really
whatever.
good, very good question. Let me say two things about that. One is that, and I do compare at certain points in the book, Jean-Luc Marion's work on icon and idol with Maritain. And so I think an idol and an icon can both suggest a kind of indefinite series of other things, but they're different. They're different types of things, I think, and they're also different in our stance toward them. So the idol, and Marion's often not clear, but he actually has a phrase where he says that the idol, when we reach it and see it and encounter it, what we get is proportionate to the expectation of our desire. So the idol gives us what we want, right? It's a kind of consumer relationship. I know what I want, and here's my money. The idol provides it. The idol satisfies, as he says, the libido videndi, the lust of seeing, right? That means that the idol can suggest all sorts of other things, but they're basically variations on the same theme of the satisfaction of the desires I already have. The icon is not just looked at, the icon looks back, right? And we have to be beheld and not just an objective, detached seer of an object that's there to satisfy our antecedent desire. The icon looks back at us, and in that exchange of looking, we're put in question, right? The icon suggests the infinite mirror of analogy. As what I said in one point there is that for Maritain, this also is an experience of surprise and wonder. I think the icon provides that, and the idol, I think we could argue, doesn't. There's no great surprise in the idol. We're getting what we bargained for and what we want. In the icon, we constantly get new mysteries that open up into a greater richness. And I think in the icon, we're also moving upward and not just like this. I also think that this is an icon right here, right? This image is an icon. It's pretty hard to treat that as an idol in the way that Maritain is discussing idols, right? We have to seriously abuse it as an image to treat it as an idol. Because what it represents, if we see ourselves in it, we see our own misery, our own sin, our own loneliness and isolation, our own curse, right? We see in it. So, and what I didn't talk about at the beginning of the Miserere, these images 6 through 8, where he presents an image of a face. Are we not all convicts? And then the next is one of these garish, self-righteous kings, supposing ourselves kings. The next image, who does not wear a mask? Right? Rouault thinks that if we're going to encounter his art properly, we're going to have to be put in question by it. We're going to have to be, in a sense, he's very much of a certain strain of modern art in this, where the artist has to offend the viewers. The artist has to offend and accuse the viewer. It's the Baudelaire line, right, from The Wasteland. You hypocrite reader, my likeness, my friend. But here it's the hypocrite spectator, not the hypocrite reader, right? He's accusing us of a kind of hypocrisy in wanting to remain a detached viewer of things that we need to be transformed by. And the icon presents that transformation.
Tom, let me ask you a question to the degree that this is kind of part of your talk. How would you think about a movie like The Passion of the Christ in relationship to transcendence and suffering and being open up to beauty?
So a couple thoughts about that. I'm in print on this, so you can go find it. You know, in response to some of the complaints about excessive violence, René Girard, I think, said these were the two most horrible experiences, punishments that the Romans could inflict, right? Torture and flogging and crucifixion. And there are some scenes in there that the opening scene in the garden I really love. It's a beautiful, and you know, Gibson, I don't think he achieved this, but he said what he wanted to do was to present a moving Caravaggio. And Caravaggio's own images are rather directly anticipate the visual language of film, I think. Having said that, and I don't remember whether Girard is defending the lengthy torture scenes and so forth. It seems to me that one of the pieces I wrote was about the collaboration, the earlier collaboration between M. Night Shyamalan and Mel Gibson. Back when Shyamalan was making movies that people wanted to watch. But I suggested that that film would have been a lot better if Mel had given it to M. Night and said, edit this. Because one of the things that Shyamalan occasionally gets really right in his films is the sense of indirect suggestion and suspense and mystery. And Gibson just wants to make it all literal and explicit. And that undermines the emotional experience that we ought to have in encountering these moments of torture and crucifixion. And I think both the literal way in which he, and the sort of excessively macho way, you know, Christ gets up at one point, it's like he's saying, is that all you got? Give me more. which seems to me to be a deep distortion. But the literal and explicit way in which he wants us to encounter the violence undermines the way in which we should encounter that violence. It overwhelms and stupefies the imagination in ways that are really unhealthy for us as viewers.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Okay, so my question is about facile transcendence. And so, you know, I'm an artist, and when I hear dialogues about transcendence, I start to get really nervous because
Fair enough.
the thing that artists love is physicality and
Yeah.
materiality.
Yes.
And so, what is it in Maritain what does he offer that allows these artists that you've mentioned to stay put
Yeah.
and not go and fly away to a different realm?
Yeah, well, so I ended with Rouault, and I think Rouault's better than Maritain on this, right? There are places in art and scholasticism where Maritain explicitly denies that the materiality part of it is actually part of the virtue of art. That art is an intellectual virtue of making. I find that problematic, what he says there, even on an Aristotelian or Thomistic grounds, right? Because it's a virtue of making, but its goal is to actually make something. It's not just to possess the virtue, right? Although there is a difference between the intellectual virtue of art and the virtue of prudence, both of which are active virtues of the active life and intellectual, right? I can't be said to have the moral virtue if there's an occasion where I'm called to activate it and I don't, right? So if someone's about to be harmed in front of me in a very damaging way and I can easily intervene to stop that, if I don't do anything, there are all sorts of virtues I can be said not to have. It's not the same to say in the realm of art, right? Just if I've got an occasion to exercise it and I don't, that doesn't mean I don't have the virtue. So there are some differences. But I think he's wrong to separate these things out. Gilson is actually better on this point than Maritain is in his work on, he gave the Mellon lectures like 3 years after Maritain did. I think I'm inclined toward, I'd love to hear more about what you think and what your own practice as an artist is like, but I'm inclined more toward your view. That's why I turned at the end to say it's got to be genuinely eschatological, right? Which is not an escape from this world. I see a new heavens and a new earth, the transformation of this very reality, right? These bodily conditions, not an escape from the body and from the created order. So, I take it that's what, implicitly, at least what Rouault is doing in these late landscapes, where he's presenting, almost all of these have really humble images of the human within the context of the natural world. There are others where the mirroring of the human figure to the natural order of trees and things is even more explicit. And the human faces are not given a great deal of definition. But humans belong in this natural world that he's depicting. And the natural world and the human world of buildings, the built environment itself, is also harmoniously part of this, right? But it's all caught up in a kind of manifestation of a serene sacredness that I think he's trying to communicate. And what is that but an anticipation of the new heavens and the new earth, which is physical, right? Transformed, but physical, not a denial of the body. Yes, I think Rouault's much better than Maritain on this. And again, I mean, part of my thesis, Natalie Carnes in conversations with her helped me to see what my thesis, part of my thesis was when I was working on early drafts of this. But part of my thesis is that the artists at this period are ahead of the philosophers. They got there first. And they got there more in a richer and more compelling way.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you, Thomas.
Get out of class early. Thank you.